This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Atom Audio, Isotope, Native Instruments, Lewitt, and Grace Design. You're hearing my voice right now on the Lewitt PureTube microphone through the Grace Design M201 Mark II mic pre mixed through Isotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar, all on Atom Audio monitors. Please check out our awesome sponsors using the link in the show notes below. It's a great way to help support this show, and there's some great deals waiting for you there. Now get ready to rock.
What's funny is the acoustic guitar sound in general is two of the guys playing acoustic guitar on a figure eight pattern against each other, playing the exact same shapes and the exact same part. And we would really hyper focus on making sure that their acoustic cadence and everything was as closely matched as possible. And that's what you hear on the record. We were just going for this very specific sound performance.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey, Rockstar, come on over here. I've got a secret to tell you. Want to know how I get a consistent sound mixing over 1,000 hours of recording studio rock stars? Well, my secret is using Isotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar to make this podcast sound great. Right now, you are hearing RX breath control, declick, declip, DS, deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, Neutron EQ, and limiting, all from Isotope. Use the secret code ROCK10 to get 10% off over at isotope.com. Are you recording your own music or other people's music in your studio, but you're having trouble figuring out how to get your mixes to sound great? Do they sound kind of weak or distant or lack punch and clarity? Well, I've got a gift to help you take your mixes from sounding like basement demos to sounding much closer to professional mixes. And it's my free course called Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools, and the best part is that these mixing techniques work for you in any DAW, whether you're on Logic, Cubase, Studio One, Reaper, anything you can think of. If you're ready now to make your best record ever, then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and you can find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Howdy, rock stars. It's your host, Lid Shaw. Welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Ken Sluiter, a Grammy-nominated recording engineer, producer, and mixer who's been on the podcast before for episodes RSR111 and RSR194, when we talked about his background in music and recording and shared some awesome mixing tips for your studio. Ken's credits include artists such as Morrissey, Flogging Molly, Andra, Divine Fits, Hart, Jerry Lee Lewis, James Blunt, Weezer, the Mekons, Jesus Lizard, and OK Go, to name just a few of the many, many bands he's worked with. And he's worked with many audio greats in the studio like Joe Chiccarelli, Jim Scott, and Andrew Scheps, all of which we've talked about before. It's been a few years since we've chatted with Ken, so today I'm really excited to have him back, and we're going to focus on what's new at his studio and surely sharing some thoughts on mixing in stereo and immersive audio. That's my prediction. Thanks again to Brad Wood for making our original introduction. Please welcome back to the podcast, Ken Sluiter, to Recording Studio Rockstars. Ken, are you ready to rock yet again, my friend?
I am ready to rock, Lidge. Good to see you.
Good to have you back here, man, and good to see you. You're joining us today from your studio. Is this your home studio that you're in now?
Yeah, I moved with my family and we moved to Monrovia, which is east of Pasadena. So basically, my wife and I said, how far out can we live and still be in LA? And we were looking for high school. We have kids, all that stuff. We wanted to buy a house. And so we finally discovered this area, and it's fantastic because it feels like we live in a small town. But I'm not around the corner from Hollywood, but I can get into Hollywood for, sessions, meetings, and whatnot. And it's been great.
Is that closer than Anaheim? That would sort of be my reference for being outside of LA, but not, well, I don't know if you'd call that terribly far away or not too terribly far away.
Yeah, it's a bit closer. With LA, so much of it has to do with what time of day you're trying to get somewhere.
Yeah.
And there's nowhere's easy to get in LA. It's gotten, I mean, I know that's the cliche to discuss traffic in LA, and I've been in other cities that have traffic that feels about as bad, but yeah, it can be crazy. The differential between, say, for example, if I'm trying to get into Hollywood at 9 a.m., that's an hour. If I want to get to Hollywood at 9 p.m., it could be 25 minutes. It could be less than half the time.
Yeah. I know traffic is old news, but it really is significant when you're trying to figure out how to get places. And then, of course, we live in a world where a lot of us are building home studios, and that becomes very relevant for that particular reason. I remember visiting LA and driving with a buddy, and he was getting stressed out about, having to take a 10-minute break to pop into a store and back out because we were watching the traffic, the timing difference increase in real time. You could see it on the map. It's like, oh, if you wait 5 minutes now, it's like 45 minutes to get across town.
It's it's like a game. Like the video game in LA is sitting watching your ways, trying to figure out the best time to leave and get somewhere. And I will say, and obviously COVID has really changed things. But even before that, I was starting to realize for myself that I was spending less time actually in a session with artists and more time mixing by myself. And that's only become, more prevalent. And so that really informed how far away do I need to live from the studio. And, now when I do recording sessions in general, it's a few days. It's a few days here. I'm usually working, for example, and I mean, this gets into a bigger conversation about the way a session happens these days.
Yeah.
It used to be when I first moved here, you would get hired onto a record and you might work on that record for 6 to 8 weeks, like 6 days a week. And that still happens a bit. I'm sure there's people out there that say, hey, well, that's what I'm doing now. But in general, the biggest change I would say is that for recording engineers specifically, is that now the producer's the one who has the hard drive. The producer is the one who holds the master. And they're going to take the artist through all the overdub and mixing process. So you might only get called to record loud things, drums, guitars, rhythm sections.
If
so
you're
you
a studio or if you're engineering in a big studio setting, you mean?
Yeah, if you're engineering in a big studio setting and so, maybe I'll go into Hollywood or a studio in the Valley for 4 or 5 days and cut rhythm tracks. And then maybe I'm not involved in the session. And maybe I'll get involved at some point again towards, maybe even if I mix it. But in general, that producer will likely either go back to their home studio. Everybody has a functional home studio now, even if it's just an Apollo and a couple speakers. And so much of record making to a certain point is just crafting and trying things and seeing what works. And you don't do that when you're on the clock of a big studio in particular.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear you describe it, because I think initially the question was, oh, if there's this new world where you got the commercial studio and then the home studio, then the home studio was a place that overdubs would happen. Like that was the first iteration. But now it's like a given that anybody who's producing a record is simply going to want to just open up the sessions and mess with them. Like maybe they're editing, maybe they're doing a little practice mixing, maybe they're treating sounds and recomposing. It doesn't even have to be a place with a microphone.
Exactly. Or maybe just one microphone.
Yeah.
Just one microphone to do something. And so what happens is that so many traditional recording techniques can really come into play. So say, for example, if I'm recording a drum kit, I really want to record that thing the way I want it to sound as a finished mixed drum kit to a point, because once that Pro Tools session goes off, I might not ever see it again. Whereas if I record a drum kit to give somebody every option they would ever want in the world, then I'm leaving it up to somebody else to define what the drum sound is going to be. And, and so you have to strike the balance between, I want to give enough flexibility and options that people can move this thing where it needs to be, but at the same time, and I'll tell people when we're in the session, like, do you like the way the drums sound now? Because we're committing to that to a point. I'm not going to put the kick and snare on the room and overheads all on 2 tracks. Although I would like to sometimes, that you have to give a little bit of flexibility. But the assumption is you might not ever see those tracks again have another round to do your thing on them. That might not ever happen.
Yeah. So I'll say that back to you. So what you're describing is the difference between when you go in to record drums, for example, and you have the vision for the record, you might focus the microphone choices and the drum tuning and all that kind of stuff in a very particular direction that gives you a defined sound. Whereas if you're doing a session for somebody else who's going to take the drums and go off and do who knows what to it, you're going to try and give them many more options if possible.
Kind of the other way around, I think. In other words, I think that you have to give them enough options to do things, but at the same time, the overall concept of what you want the drums to sound like. In other words, I would say that on paper, it seems like a good idea to give everybody all the options, but at the same time, I feel like I've sort of crossed the threshold now where I think if someone's going to call me to do something because it's the way that they like the way that I did it on something previous, so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to be a stickler for. Well, I'm jumping around a little bit because this is sort of like more of a mixing tip, but I'll say this. Everybody likes a big, roomy drum sound. Everybody likes, let's not gate the toms. I love the ring. I love the ring of the, don't put anything in the kick drum. It's like, so now the drums have a real tone to them. And that's great. That's a great sound. If that tone is a pitch that's a half step off of the key signature of the song, you're going to struggle with that drum sound. And you're like, oh yeah, well, we'll fine tune that in the mix. And then you get into the mix and you're like, I'm listening to the guitars and the bass and I'm listening to everything and it all sounds good. Why doesn't it sound good when I put it all together? And, oftentimes it'll be the drummer's playing a drum tom pattern. That's like a pattern. Doom, 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 doom. And that thing's going doom, doom, doom. And it's a half step lower than the key signature of the song. When you put it all together, it's going to sound like mud. So there's certain things like that I've become more sensitive to. I wasn't always, but now it's like, wait a minute, we have to fix this now. Like we have to fix this. We have to go look at and you can either do one of two things. You can either tune the drums so that they're in a complementary pitch to the key of the song, or you tune the drums so that they're dead and they don't ring out.
Right, so that there's no chance they're going to fight.
Yeah, exactly. But there are certain things that need to happen at the tracking date, and so those are the things that I try to focus on.
Let me jump back in for a sec, and I'll say this back to you the correct way now. So it's very fascinating actually, because now you just reset my thinking on this, because I was thinking before that the obvious choice would be they're taking the drums home. You don't know what they're going to do with them. Give them a bunch of mics and let them, then they got options. But I think what you've just said is, no, you're more inclined to really define a drum sound. And that does make a lot of sense, because if you let people take something home and it's sort of totally undefined, they might just open it up and play it all together and think, well, this doesn't sound like anything. Versus when you help them really arrive at a particular drum tuning, drum sound. It's got a real character to it that fits the song. They're going to get home and play these tracks and think, holy shit, this sounds great.
That's the hope. Yeah. And that's always the hope. And that's always the goal. Sometimes if somebody wants to cut, we're gonna cut 10 songs today, because I kind of, in my mind, I call them like punk rock records, where people come in and they, day one, they record the basic tracks. Day two is the overdubs. Day three is the mix of like 10 to 15 songs at once, indie rock, punk rock style, which, and I've certainly enjoyed those sessions, and there's a lot to be learned on, not unlike your Bonnaroo sessions, sometimes when you're working on a large amount of material in a short amount of time, that's a different recording style. You might need to leave a little bit more options open. You might not need to be able to get so specific. You want to find a sound that's going to work across a bunch of tunes. But if you're working on, if your schedule is like, I'm going to do 2 tracks a day, so to cut 10 songs, we're going to spend 5 days on 10 songs. You can really get into, even the snare drum. You can tune the snare drum to a pitch, to the tonic or to the fifth, and get really into it, because it all is going to, once you get into the mix, you're going to exaggerate the detail on all these things. And so if it's good, you're going to exaggerate what's good. And if it's not quite right, it's only going to exaggerate what's not quite right.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I know what you mean about doing the multi-song sessions. There's a thing I enjoy about doing those in the studios also. In the studio also. I like the feeling of, I like the excitement of setting up for a full tracking session, and the pressure of getting everything to sound great and getting rolling as fast as possible. And it is fun to see a band crank out stuff and really enjoy it. So it is fun to participate in that. And you're absolutely right. By definition, there's no time to deeply explore what's possible with each song. But sometimes what happens in those moments is that because the engineering doesn't interfere with the music making and it just sort of becomes transparent, then all the musical discoveries are like the discovery of the band in the moment and the people playing together. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about it, because there are positives and negatives to all these different ways of making records.
For sure. I mean, everything I just said, at the same time, you have to balance that with reading the room. Like, these musicians are hot to play right now. Let's get the performance, and we'll figure out the sound, later. And but I know for myself, say for example, well, when it comes to tracking a band, and I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And there's and I've done it all different ways, and I've done the right and wrong way. I've learned sometimes from doing things the wrong way, but in general, I tend to think of those types of sessions as one of 2 ways of doing it. One way is where they might be playing along to a demo or some pre-recorded tracks, meaning that, okay, now we're going to record the rhythm section, but we're going to record it against this like drum loop or scratch vocal. Or sometimes maybe the singer wants to do a scratch vocal, and you're working off of a click, and those types of sessions in general, and I can only speak in Pro Tools because that's how I record that stuff. But every take you do a new playlist, and so you build up playlists. So if you do 10 takes of a song, you have 10 playlists.
Yeah.
So that's one way of doing it. And then the other way of doing it is this band isn't going to record to a click track, or maybe they will, maybe they won't, but there's no pre-recorded tracks. They're just live in the room. And in those sessions, I just put Pro Tools in record, and I'll keep it in record the entire time. And that way, even a band, hey, hold on, can we just review that pre-chorus? Let's just do a loop of that pre-chorus. And while they're rehearsing it, hashing it out, I might be recording it, because that drummer might play the drum fill into the chorus in a way that's magical. And so you just grab it all and you sort it all out later. And that's a great way of working as well. And and sometimes even if those songs or those types of sessions have a click track, I might just turn the click track off and then just pop it on every now and then when they want to hear it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to say something back about that too, because I've been putting myself out as a guitarist in this session, that's your instrument also, right? Guitar or guitar, bass, a little bit of everything?
Guitar. So, as a guitar player, you learn bass to a certain degree.
Yeah,
I tell people, like, I know where middle C is on a keyboard. I know how to make chord shapes and I can kind of make things happen, but I could never, and even with guitar, I could never accompany a singer as a guitarist. I have the chops to play in a rock ensemble, but I don't have the chops to play like, hey, can you come and do a Sunday brunch with me and play standards? No, I could never do that. And living in LA was similar to Nashville. You could be like a reasonably good musician in the context of being in rock bands and playing in rock bands. And then you start working with session musicians and everyone's like, hey, do you play guitar? And I'm like, no. No, I don't play anything. Not compared to the way you guys do.
Yeah. I hear that a lot in Nashville too. And I'm like, come on, everybody. Let's not everybody give up guitar just because there's, these hot shit guitarists here. Look, if you're like me, then you love having cool instruments in your studio, right? No matter what style of music you make, Native Instruments gives your studio all the instruments and sounds you need, from drums, loops, and beats to the coolest synthesizers, realistic strings, guitar amps, and futuristic synth pads. I love recording and tracking real bands in my studio, but then adding awesome overdubs from Contact, Massive X, Super 8, Battery, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid Keys, for example. Use the code ROCK10 now to get 10% off, or get Complete Start for free today with a bundle of 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples, all over at nativeinstruments.com. Well, I was just going to say I remember the first time somebody showed up, and it might have even been like my brother's jazz band or something showed up, and it was like, the whole record was just one long session and all the songs were in there somewhere. And I was like, what the hell, But as somebody who's been playing guitar and who's actually out there with the band working it out, I've learned that the beauty of letting it roll, like you just described, is there's something that never happens to disturb the session is nobody ever has to say, we're rolling, just before you have to perform something. And that's a big deal, You want to be able to just start playing when you feel it in that moment and not be interrupted.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a big part of it is that you're capturing everything at the same time. There's not that you're rolling, it's just a totally different way of working, and they're both very valid. And,
yeah.
And sometimes it's because the guitar player plays a little lick in the front or something, and you're just like, oh my God, that's a magical moment. We're gonna use that in the tune, and it's nice to be able to capture it.
Yeah,
sure.
And then Rockstars, I think a really good takeaway from hearing this back and forth too is just remembering that it's super important for you to learn each of these ways of working as best you can, because, and I'm sure you feel this way too, Ken, which is that you need to know as an engineer or as a producer, in that moment, you have to be like, okay, today, this is exactly how we're going to do the session. And you have to be ready to like flip your whole way of working in a different direction, potentially, when the moment you recognize which of those ways is the best way to do it.
Yes. And I would even go so far there as to say, the more I do this, and I look at, you start building like your techniques, like it's like a little toolbox of things. And every now and then I have to look and say to myself, like, is this technique I've been doing really working for me? Like, how successful is this really? You'll see somebody who does something that you go, well, I don't do it that way. No, that's not how I make records. I don't use that kind of equipment. And then it's like, well, you know what? Maybe I'll start using that kind of equipment. Maybe I'll try something new. I go through phases where I'm more open to changing my technique, and then phases where I'm like, no, I'm double downing on what I know, and there's times and places for both of those things. for sure.
Yeah. So now we've got lots of things to talk about today on the show, but one of the comments you mentioned earlier that sounds like it's what you're talking about now too, is this kind of changing studio industry too in LA and everywhere. And, the concept of like making beats with a laptop versus recording bands in a proper studio. And what does that mean? And is that one of the things that you found yourself, seeing something that was the opposite of what you did in a moment and thinking, okay, that's the next opportunity for me to figure out?
Well, let me figure out a way to say what I feel about this without sounding like an old man yelling at the clouds, which is inevitably where this will go. I can't help it. It's funny because when I was younger, I was really into technology, meaning like I loved when I first heard the Human League's Don't You Want Me, and I heard that cold synthesizer playing against that drum machine, that like super rigid groove. I loved it. Loved it. Loved Human League, Gary Newman. And that informed, getting into so the 80s. I loved the 80s. I loved everything about it.
It's awesome.
So one would think that when EDM came about, that I would have embraced that too, because it's a lot of the same, way of working. But somehow it all just kind of like left me a little bit cold. And now I feel like there's people who make laptop music with beats and for every example, and I'm not going to like give specific examples, but there's somebody who's doing it very creatively. But I think that in general, what I've seen is that there's people who, well, I'll say this much. When Billie Eilish's record went through the roof and it came out that she made it in her bedroom with her brother, at that point, from what I've seen, I don't think anybody who owned a studio like wanted that story to come out, because in general, I don't think that record labels value their relationships with recording studios. If there can be done cheaper and if it can be done in someone's home or rehearsal space, they're fine with that, as long as it does what it needs to do, which is find its place, find its audience. Right.
And if somebody at a label is pushing pencils and looking at dollar signs and then reads an article about that, then they might just conclude, oh, home studio is all you need.
Home studio is all you need to a point, but then suddenly, and they're brilliant. She's brilliant and he's brilliant. That's some of the best music that's ever, that I've heard in the last few years. I feel like it's really inspiring. But at the same time, I think sometimes when you get what I've seen in some of the bigger studios is that that's their work methodology. And the reason why they're in the studios is for the amenities, meaning that there's runners that are. I always think to myself, for a recording studio, it's not just about the microphones and the great rooms and the great gear. It's about what the services are going to be and whether my client's going to like parking in the studio or like the parking situation in that studio, whether the runners are going to just kind of hand you the wrong order. And I think we've even discussed this probably on earlier, but if you are suddenly on a project and you're working at home and then you realize, well, if I go to this studio, we're not going to stop and go get our own food. Someone will take care of that for us. If somebody from the label wants to stop by for a playback, they're not coming into my home studio or into my house. They're coming into a neutral location, and that changes the conversation. If you go to, then that's the tricky thing about home studios is that sometimes I'll be working on something, producing, and I'll realize like, hey, I have to be a little bit careful because I'm not in charge of the session just because we're working in my room. But people have a pleasing tendency and they feel like they're a guest in your home, and you know where I'm going.
Right.
With all that.
So you're saying that the client themselves might even hold back a little because they feel like they're a guest in your home studio as well. Is that part of that? Like they might not make as bold of a decision as they would typically make in a different setting?
I think that does come up, and I think that some people like being in a neutral location that no one has like a real investment in. And
Yeah.
well, and I can tell you that there's a lot of sessions, and now we're getting into like some, like old school rock and roll sessions where, I mean, I've seen engineers fired on the spot and another engineer walks in 20 minutes later,
Right. That's not going to happen in your own home studio.
It's not going to happen in a home studio. So in other words, you have to have, it changes the relationship between you and your artist client. And sometimes it changes it for the better, and sometimes it's not preferred. And,
Right.
and I don't mean to be, so hedging my bets and everything I'm saying. I'm just saying that I find for myself, one of my biggest challenges as I'm navigating my way through my own career and through dealing with clients is figuring out, what would this client appreciate? Would they appreciate real privacy of a home studio, or do they like to get out and be somewhere where people are going to pop their heads in?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating topic. And then even what you were talking about before is knowing all these different aspects of what might be required for the best version of a record when you're making it. It's sort of funny to think that you might even consider whether allowing yourself to get easily fired from the record is actually what's best for the record.
Well,
if you host it at your home studio, that's not going to happen so easily.
Right, but it does change the dynamic. And also when it comes to producing, I feel like sometimes, and I've said this before, and I maybe even said it on your show, but if you don't feel like you're occasionally at the point of possibly getting fired, sometimes maybe you're not doing your job. And what I'm saying is that, your job isn't to be the concierge and make everyone as comfortable as possible. And I'm not talking about the studio space or the environment. I'm talking about in the making of the record, where if you have an artist who is who wants their next project to do better than the previous one, then we have to do things differently. Then we have to try something different. And if we all get comfortable in the way we know how to do things, we're going to keep getting the same result.
That's fair. And that also accompanies that idea of doing the 10 songs in a day record. You're actually trying to dial something in to allow the same result from song to song. And then the only opportunity to change it up is to make, fast musical decisions as the band too. Yeah.
And pressure is oftentimes good for those situations as well.
Yeah.
Pressure and momentum, that okay, now we're on a roll. The one thing what's great about the way that we can work on records now is that you can take your time and really, come back to things.
Oh boy.
And that's great. But also, but that's also the bad part of it, whereas sometimes it's like, hey, listen, we have the studio for another, 4 hours. Like, we need to make a decision here, because are you going to be that more musically informed 4 days from now than you are right now? Probably not. We need to make the decision now when we can and build on decisions.
Yeah. So that, I mean, I know we're just kind of going in every direction we think of, but this is what we do, right? This is what we make music. We make art. We talk about it in the same way. The pressure, like, I absolutely 100% know what you're talking about. When I do a power weekend in the studio with the band and we record 8 songs, 10 songs in a weekend, and there's no time for anything to take a moment longer than it has to. You just got to keep trucking. There's creative things that happen in there that just were not going to happen if I had a nice, long, relaxed day in the studio. And so there's a huge advantage to pressure if you play it right, And
for sure.
And I absolutely know that I've experienced that thing where you have creative ideas in the moment that you can't get back if you came back again later to do it. It's like you almost can't get back in the same headspace without building up the pressure again. It's like a steam kettle or something.
Yeah. I mean, and for certain bands, I mean, as you were saying that, I remember many years ago back at King Size in Chicago, that was the studio that I was partners with Dave Trumpio and Mike Hagler. Mike Hagler and I were recording Jesus Lizard was coming in on the weekends. And what they would have is we would do like 3 days, sometimes maybe even less. And they would come in with 18 songs. And each weekend they would play all 18 songs. And then they would rehearse during the week, like listening back to what they did, come in and they'd be a little bit more refined. Come back a week later, they'd be a little bit more refined. And that's the way they like to work. But it was like recording a live set of a band.
Yeah.
And I've come to learn that I believe that was the way, and I'm not sure about this, but I think some of like the way Rick Rubin would work with Rage Against the Machine or some of those projects where they would literally just, today we're going to record all 10 songs that we're considering for the record. And then tomorrow we'll try them all again. And we'll keep doing it until eventually. So like on one day, things were cooking and we got 3 masters. Well, that's great. You got 3 songs, but they wouldn't want to go and play the same song 10 times over.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point because it doesn't necessarily get better if you play it 10 times over.
That's right.
I've got the famous chart on the wall in the other room where you see it. And it's like there's the moment you walk in the studio take, and then there's, maybe take 2, which is like not necessarily much better than take 1, but it has fewer mistakes. And then it just goes down this steep downhill, and then there's sort of this mysterious Q zone at take 50 or something that might be infinitesimally, it might be infinitesimally better than take 1 or something like that.
Yeah, no, I've seen that chart, and it doesn't make any sense, but it is true. That is how it seems to happen.
Yeah, well, and it's fascinating to think of records too, where you might pivot back and forth between, okay, we're going to really focus on these 3 songs, but we're also willing to re-record a song. I mean, that, like, if you go into a record knowing you're going to do the whole set list and then come back and do it again, that's one thing. But boy, is it a threshold to get over if you think, you know what, we're going to scrap that version of this song and we're just going to do it again. That's a really tough threshold, I think. It can be really difficult to make that decision. And sometimes it's really what was needed.
Well, and sometimes what ends up happening, here's a perfect story. Dave, my old studio partner, he and his brother had a band, and Mike and I were sort of in the band as well. We played on stuff and we all worked on it together. And one song, we had probably spent a week on the song, and then somebody mixed it. And when they mixed it, they slowed it down a little bit. And I don't think that the mix got used, but he was right about the tempo. And so Dave said, let's cut it at that tempo. And we had a tight deadline to get it out. And the song that we had spent a week on, now that we knew how it really needed to be, we had finished it in a day. We did it in a day. So we finally had cracked the code and we knew what we needed to do. So we just knocked it out quickly and it was a better version.
Yeah. Now, how do you feel about that as a mixer? Do you feel like that was a critical decision that was arrived at the mix stage?
In that particular example? It's funny because in that era, you couldn't slow down a song without slowing down the pitch.
Right.
And, it was an example of, I just think that in general, when you're mixing, you need to do what you think the song needs. And even if that means that they're not going to use your mix, you need to be honest with yourself. For example, if, and I've said this before, but if a band presents themselves as, we're a 4-piece guitar rock band, you don't go, hey, I think we're going to add a string pad on the bridge. That's not what the band does, But if it's, say, for example, a solo artist,
there goes all my ideas.
Yeah. Although, what's funny is sometimes you listen to Aerosmith records and a lot of hard rock records, and you're hearing percussion and tambourines and mellotrons and all these things that you don't think of as rock and roll instruments are all over it. Or maybe, you don't hear the hi-hat until the chorus.
Yeah.
And so the whole verse, the verse might be the hi-hats playing the backbeat with a tom pattern. And then suddenly when we hit to the chorus and they go to an open hi-hat, it sounds like the song exploded. Well, then now when we get to the bridge, now we can go to a ride cymbal. Whereas I find, and again, here I am, old man yelling at the clouds, like with a lot of rock music, when the band comes in and in the first chorus, they've splashed and the entire drum kit's already done everything it can do, gone to its top dynamic, then you start getting into these like studio trickery stunts of like, okay, now we're going to take all the reverb off and we're going to like suck it into this tiny little sound, and we're going to make it sound like we're going to make it sound like the radio for one bar before we hit the chorus. And it turns into these production techniques that kind of sometimes really date the song. And it's a shame that has to happen, because sometimes if you just work it out in pre-production, you can really make build the excitement and the drama into a song off the floor of the rhythm section.
Yeah, I think that's a great topic too, about recording, because one of the things I feel like I keep discovering over and over again is there's a huge dynamic of possibility of sound going into a microphone. And meaning, if we allow ourselves to sort of gain up the microphones and perform our instruments in such a way that we hold back, we know when to hold back and we know when to explode, there's a great deal of everything you just described that can be written before it even gets recorded, versus I think what I'm hearing you say, which is when we don't do that, or when we forget to do that, or the times where we intentionally don't do that, that leaves the end of the creation process, the mixing stage, as the canvas on which we're going to have to make all that dynamic.
Exactly. And I'll do it, I'll do whatever I can do. Like, it's not uncommon for me to, and now we're getting into specifics, but my master fader, sometimes my master fader over a course of 16 bars might creep down like slowly 3 dB. So when the chorus hits, it creates a accent on that downbeat of the chorus.
Oh, fascinating.
But I know I can't make the chorus louder. I've run out of headroom. I can't make it louder. But if I go and I make the verse quieter, that's not really going to work either. So what I'll do is I'll slowly, like I said, over the course of a 16 bars, I'll slowly sneak it down. Sometimes it's just 1.5 dB, so it's very subtle. But I'll do whatever I can to make the song do what it needs to do when it needs to do it. But as much as possible, you want the band to be involved in that, and you want it to happen with the band. A perfect example is if you listen to, what song was it? There's always some song that's like been like a song that I've listened to since I was a kid, and then you're suddenly listening to it and you're realizing, my God, the tambourine is the loudest thing on this song by far. It's just right there. But it's like a song will come on the radio and it'll be a classic hit, and you notice in the first chorus you'll hear a tambourine hit on the 4s, every 4. Next chorus comes along and the tambourine's hitting on the 2 and 4, every backbeat. And then when they get to the bridge, the tambourine's hitting on every beat, and then that carries on to the outro. And so what it allows is the band to keep reinforcing hooks by playing the progression over and over, but dynamically it's building and changing as you get through the whole song. And there's formulas to do that, and good producers know how to do it, and it's usually very subtle and effective.
Atom Audio's S-Series, crafted in Berlin, is a flagship line of reference monitors featuring 5 models, from the compact S2V all the way up to the powerful S5H. The range builds on Atom Audio's iconic heritage with new technology for improved acoustic performance. With new woofers, redesigned waveguides, and a DSP engine, the S-Series ensures accurate frequency response, consistent dispersion, enhanced detail, and a forward-looking digital connectivity. Backed by a 5-year guarantee, Atom Audio monitors embody durability and professional sound for your studio at atomaudio.com. When do you think you discovered the master fader trick? That's such a cool concept, but and as somebody hearing you say that, I think like, "Ooh, I want to try that," but then I'm like, "Oh shit, where would I try that? What song would I try that on?" What sort of session made you think that was the right thing to do, and when would you think about using that? If you're sharing that as advice for the rock stars.
Well, I think that the whole like bumping the chorus up a dB, just bumping everybody up a dB. I would even do that like in mastering, just with the file, and usually you can't bump things up. You have to turn other things down. So I don't know where I figured that out and learned how to do that. The sort of doing the subtle little, like across 16 bars, that I stole from an interview with Butch Vig.
Nice.
I have to say, I cannot take credit for that. On some interview with Butch Vig, I heard him saying like, well, yeah, I'll just sort of creep the fader down a little bit over time. And I'm like, that's a great way to do it, because the listener never hears it. You never hear what's happening, and it's very effective. And I think that, I'll say, I've met him and assisted on sessions with him a few times, but he's a Midwesterner. So the times I've met him, he's just super. I don't know if you've had it on the show or not, but
Butch has not been on the show yet. He needs to come on. Butch, we need you on the show.
I don't know him well enough to make that happen, but I can get the message to him for sure. But the times I've met him, he's such a nice guy. But the one thing I'll say is that, people talk about him in the context of Nirvana and the Smashing Pumpkins, of which, yeah, he should, but Garbage is that's talk about timeless pop music that where he's using everything. He's using loops, performances, chopped up craft, inspiration. Everything about that band is to this day, I really enjoy their records. And I really enjoy how, at the time when they first came out, I was like, wow, this like rock and roll grunge rock producers making this like pop record. Like, this is wild.
Well, and how cool. I mean, like those guys were like literally living the dream by doing that. And I was there. I was at Smart while they were working upstairs. Mm-hmm. And I remember that time and just, crossing paths a little bit. But I was so struck by that. I thought like, man, what a cool concept to like, make other people's records until to a point at which you sort of have this vocabulary for music, and then just say, you know what, we're going to put our own band together and do a thing. And I remember hearing that they, auditioned singers for it until they found the complete band and got everybody together, and it was worked right off the bat. But I just think there's an element in all of us that, sometimes makes records with other artists thinking, well, I kind of want to do this too. So I thought that was very cool as well.
No, it's their whole story is really inspiring. And I was working on a session at Smart when they were working in the other room, and they were spending, 2 weeks on one song. You hear one song coming out of the speakers, and they were crafting and just refining it over and over. And I had the chance to work with Shirley. She did a bunch of stuff for, I was working with Brian Reitzel doing scoring American Gods, and she sang on a couple songs and even sings on the main titles. And she came in like with tons of great lyrics, just a great singer, right attitude, really fun, really pleasant to work with. And
she came over from Scotland, right?
I think she's Scottish. Yeah. I mean, I've only worked with her a couple times, but that whole camp, I'm really impressed and inspired by them. All of them, her, Billy Bush, that whole, I think that they make really great music.
So not too long ago, I'm a little late to the game, I think, but I discovered the Smart Studios documentary, and it was just really fun to hear the whole like extended story of it. I mean, here we are on this podcast talking about making music. We love talking about this stuff and learning about the history of it all. Before we pivot again, when you were talking about this the drums and stuff like that. Let me ask a question about a record that's in your playlist. In Rockstars, we have Ken's playlist in the show notes, so just click down after you listen to this or when you want to hear a reference and click on the playlist and you can go listen to a bunch of these great records that he's done. But US Girls So Typically Now, that particular track sounds like the opposite end of the spectrum too, where there's a huge amount of the sound that's just being created with these great gated reverbs, and there's this incredible nod to the 80s and in all our favorite kind of ways. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that project. And even my question was like, do some of those sounds happen in the mix or do they happen in the composition? And also, there's a power to the kick and snare in that track that made me want to ask you about setting mix levels for kick and snare on a track when it needs to be sort of dance focused. And anything else you want to say about that particular project?
Sure. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that track because it's one of the favorite things I was involved in. That track was written and produced. I got a production credit on it because of some production I did on the mix, but the track was written and produced by two guys, I believe two guys, and they have a band called Holy Ghost, and I think they're New York City based, and it's one guy's name is, I think, Ryland Blankington, and the other guy's name was Alex Frankel, I believe. The artist, the singer was my point person for that, not them. But I love the track so much. I was like, who did this track? This is really great. And so a lot of those tracks came to me sounding that way. Mm-hmm. I think that, that I did some things to exaggerate it here and there. I might have, and this is sort of common, like the way that track came into me is the way like a lot of pop music seems to be made now, where the best I can tell, like I said, the singer was my point person, the singer and her management. She had written and produced the track with some guys who did the track, made stems of it. Then she sent it to her. I think she wrote the top line, produced the top line, and then brought it to me to mix. And in the mix, I think I add my kick and snare samples on top of it just to exaggerate it a little bit, but I didn't ever replace what they did. And a lot of those gated tom fills, they did all that on the original track. I can't really take credit for that. Probably the biggest thing that really made that track come alive for me from a technical point of view was I actually just stopped. I didn't use my normal 2-mix compression chain. I used this compressor that Slate Digital has called Mott. And
interesting.
It emulates a compressor called OTT that's in Ableton Live. And I think it's...
Oh, yeah. OTT.
OTT, yeah. I call it OTT. Yeah, but... I
think that stands for over the top.
Well, that sounds about right, because this thing is if I was mixing a rock band and I put it on there, it just sounds terrible. It just sounds terrible. But on this one, it was just kind of goofing around, and I'm like, well, what if I turn everything off and just pop this thing on and just flip to the presets? And I flipped through one of them, and I was like, oh, this... You
can swear on this show.
yeah, like this, now we're cooking. Like, this sounds incredible. And so that was it. Like I said, it's a setting that I never ever use, but on that track at that tempo, it just really made the thing come alive. And yeah, that was a really fun track to work on for sure.
So one of the things that's I got a couple of questions around that. One of them is just pointing out that what's fascinating about program music or EDM music or pop tracks that lean that way is because kicks and snares always hit at an absolutely controlled and same level. I think it does change some of the decisions you can make around processing and master buses and stuff. And I think that there's a lot of things that we learn from working with a rock band with real drums, bass, and guitars that are all based on what works with those instruments, where there's a whole variety of dynamic and sound levels and stuff like that. Do you think that's an accurate point to make? And is this something that you've picked up on? Do you find that there are tools that allow, because a programmed kick is always hitting at the same level, it changes the way you think on that stereo bus? Like that?
Yeah. I think that's why I don't think it would have worked otherwise. And I think it doesn't work on a rock track because there's too much variation, too much dynamic variation.
Yeah.
I would also say that just reminds me of one thing that is interesting, and it's sort of a related topic, is that when I add kick and snare samples into a track I'm mixing, it's not uncommon for me to find a snare hit of the existing snare on the track that's clean with no hi-hat bleed or anything, and then put that into my slate trigger and then have that tucked underneath the real snare. Or I'll do the same thing with the kick drum, because what I'm not trying to change the overall sound of the snare. I'm just trying to make it more consistent.
Right. Okay. So that works for boosting a live kick drum or a live snare drum, where it's like you're creating your own best of sample and reinforcing itself that way.
Yeah. Or sometimes what I'll often do is I'll then make a comp of, like, every backbeat might be the snare sample, but all the fills are the actual real snare, or if there's a ghost note, like a drag on the snare, I'll have that will be real.
Okay, cool. So let me back up and ask you this question.
Sure.
Give us something to think about. Like, when we think, like you said, I might have reinforced it with kick and snare samples, but I didn't replace it.
Right.
So in a situation like that, what does that mean? And what do we need to be thinking about? Because if we add our own samples to something else, where are the places where we're going to find, oh, that worked great? And where are places where we're going to run into a problem? Like, if we would we do that to add to an actual kick drum and a drum set? Or is this more like a perfectly aligned sample to something that was a sample to begin with? And because don't we run into low end cancellations and stuff like that?
Sure. No, that's a really good topic. I would address that sort of on two fronts. The first front, I would say, is the conceptual idea is, I like what we have here. What can I do to like it even more? So that tells me, don't change anything, just add. Don't add, don't change. And so then technically what that means to really see that through is making sure that when you add particularly a kick drum sample, with a kick drum is, in a rock band, is pretty easy just to say, you know what, I'm just going to use the kick sample. For whatever reason, oftentimes I can get rid of the real one and just use the sample. But let's say, for example, even if it's with program music, and program music meaning it's on the grid. So not only is the volume the same every hit, but as it relates to the beats are the same. So when you add your sample onto it, you just want to make sure that your phase relationship between the original kick and the sampled kick is adding to the sound and not taking the low end away from the sound. Now, that said, two different kick sounds will always add and subtract a little bit here and there across the frequency spectrum. It's not possible to just only add.
Right.
Does that make sense? In other words, you want it to add in the frequency ranges that you want the boost in, but in doing that, you're gonna cancel out in other ones further down into the frequency graph.
Right. So if you wanted to visualize it, and we were pretending that each of those kick samples was actually a drum head moving forward and backwards, it's not like each one of them is going to move forward and backwards in perfect unison. If it did, it'd just be the same kick sound. Anyway.
It would just be the exact same kick sound. And then you don't want that because so my point is that it's gonna change, but you want to just make sure that what you're doing is conceptually adding to what you want to have happen. And sometimes what it is if it's too in phase, then you can actually just blow out the low end and make the low end like completely undefined. You want it to, well, I mean, I would say that with samples in general, you listen to what you have and say, what is this lacking? Is if it's lacking a top end knock, or a tick, then you find a sample that has a lot of tick. If it has all the tick in the world that you want, but not enough like air moving at the low end, then you have samples that have a lot of low end, if that makes sense. As a matter of fact, I almost have, when it comes to drum samples, if you listen to some of my samples that I work to blend into, I have samples that are really good at replacing, and then I have samples that are really good at blending in. And the ones that are good at blending in sound like an incomplete version of the, snare or kick drum sound. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. I am massively impressed with iZotope Ozone. I've been mastering a lot of my records recently, and Ozone makes it so easy for me to get a fantastic sound. The mastering assistant will help you get started by measuring your track and suggesting all the settings you need for a professional result based on the genre and EQ curve of your choice. You can even reference a specific song if you want. Using simple yet sophisticated modules like clarity, impact, low-end focus, stabilizer, imager, exciter, and spectral shaping, along with powerful dynamic EQ, compression, and limiting, you simply adjust the settings to your own taste and it sounds incredible. And the magic of master rebalance means you can reach into your mix at the mastering stage and manipulate the vocal, bass, and drums. My bandmates are pretty demanding of my mixes, but now when I send off the masters for approval and get comments back like, holy bleep, pristine, damn good mastering, crystal clear, you're a wizard, finally I love my singing, and the drums and bass sound huge, well then I know I'm doing something right. So check out the newest Ozone, RX, and all the other great apps at iZotope.com and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off. What do songwriters, music producers, DJs, EDM, TV, and film composers all have in common with you and me? We all need incredibly cool sounds that instantly transport the music we are creating to the style that we want. This is why Native Instruments is your ultimate toolkit with a massive library of sounds for your studio. Whether you want to create hip-hop, indie pop, classic rock, meditation music, pumping dance floor beats, or full orchestral arrangements, Native Instruments' complete bundle offers you everything you need, from drums, loops, and beats to wild synths, ultra-realistic strings, and vintage electric bass, guitars, and keys. The list goes on and on. I personally love recording real bands in my studio and then adding cool drum samples, synths, and futuristic keys from Battery, Contact, Massive X, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid keys, for example. Plus, it's a great way to make your productions sound modern and unique. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off or get Complete Start for free today with a bundle of 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples over at nativeinstruments.com. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session, otherwise known as the second half of the show. My guest is Ken Sluiter, joining us again from his studio in LA. Ken, are you ready to jam, dude?
I'm ready to jam. Let's jam.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Let's jam.
Jam me.
Do you ever jam anymore? Do you jam on guitar or with bass? Do you play music with friends now just for fun?
I would love to do that. I miss it. I'm available for jamming. I'm trying to think of. No, it's been a long time. I'll play a little bit on records, and I produced a record this year that I play a bunch of guitar and keyboards on, and I really enjoy that. But even when I look back to my, in my 20s, I played in bands a lot. I was in a lot of bands, and as much as I enjoyed the shows and doing like our little indie rock band touring. We'd drive in a van all around the Midwest. I miss the rehearsals the most, like of sitting in a room with 4 guys just cracking the code of how are we gonna make this song work, and we're gonna figure it out right now together. That was my favorite, and that's what I miss the most.
That is really fun. I still get to do that, only because I decided I wanted to do it and started making it happen. So just good reminder to ourselves. We make things happen, and then we go, oh, I'm doing it now. But if you lived in my neighborhood, then you'd be invited to be in our neighborhood Halloween party band. I'm dating this podcast a little bit that we're near Halloween still, but
okay.
I've been learning to play guitar and sing Thriller this week. So
really, that's a hard one.
That is a really hard one, and I'm not sure that it's gonna. Well, it'll be scary.
Yeah. My band over Halloween there was this bar called the Double Door, and they would have like popular local bands would be a different band. And one year we were the Pretenders, and so we dressed and did sort of leaning on the first 2 albums, and that's a perfect example of this beautiful pop music that rolls. Like you listen to it and it sounds incredible. And then you go to try to learn it, and you're just like, oh man, this is some really difficult guitar playing.
Yeah.
Like, I think I'm out of my depth here.
So the Double Door was in Chicago. Was that one of those clubs? I feel like I was in a couple where there's more than one stage. So a band finishes and they just turn around and there's another stage on the other side.
No, that one had just one stage, but there was, there was Avalon had like a rock, There was a bar called Avalon that had like a rock room, and then they had the Cabaret Lounge, which would have like, as a matter of fact, that's the first time I saw Smashing Pumpkins. It was just like 2 guys in a drum machine, like playing like in the corner of like the little weird, the intimate Cabaret Lounge.
Wow.
And then I think Metro has like the main venue, and then like they have a dance club underneath it called the Smart Bar, and I think they'd have acts down there, and then they actually even had another small theater above it as well. Well, I think they still have all these things. I just don't live there anymore.
Yeah. I remember playing the Metro and seeing bands there too. There was a lot of cool clubs in Chicago. Chicago's an awesome place.
It's awesome. It's awesome for live music for sure.
Yeah. So now I want to talk about your studio and Atmos mixing, but I also thought, since we were discussing drums, you want me to hit you with another drum question before we dive into mixing stuff?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So I'll sort of like pile them all up here. So some of the songs in your playlist, there's a track by OK Go. Here It Goes Again. Really explosive sounding drums. There is the Licorice Quartet, Lighthouse Spaceship, super punchy drums against like acoustic guitars, reminded me of David Bowie, if in 2023 or something, making records. Yeah. And then Roger Joseph Manning Jr., On the Way to the Moon. I think there was hopefully we can include this in the show notes too, but a great video that accompanies that too. And I think that's a recent one, but they're all very different sounding drums too. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about, committing to some of those sounds. You talked at the beginning of this interview about going into the studio and committing to a drum sound. OK Go and Roger Manning both strike me as very, very particular commitments on the drum sound. Do you have any thoughts, or do you want to follow up with any thoughts on those?
Yeah. The OK Go, that would be Tor Johansson. The Swedish producer, cut the drums on that. I got a production credit on that song because I did the demo, and I think at some point, I think they might have used a bit of the demo, but more than anything, I hashed out the arrangement with the band.
Oh, cool!
And so
what you described being so fun to do.
Yeah. Which those guys are old friends. The singer was an intern at Dave and I's studio in Chicago, and he used to go and get our food and run our errands for us. And then one day he's like, I can edit Pro Tools. And we're like, all right, kid, we're going to go off to lunch, edit these drums. And we come back and he pressed play, and we were like, oh shit, he's really good. He's really, really good. And then of course he gives us our band demo and we're like, oh, okay, we got to help him. We have to develop, we're going to do what we can to help him get, happening. And they were all really talented guys. But yeah, that was generous of them because, they recognized that my production contribution was more in the pre-production and demo stages. Even though they went and cut it with another producer, I still was given a production credit on that. But I can't really speak to those drums. But I would say that that's it's a very good example and a very extreme example of like committing to a very specific sound. And that's what he does.
Yeah. And then, I guess part of that struck me too was letting drums be explosive or exploding sounding in their like overdrive quality, but not having the cymbals make you hate that idea, and you talked about saving hi-hats till later, things like that too.
Yeah, well, that's it's funny you mentioned that in the Licorice Quartet, because I think that the one thing when I was I've been fortunate over the years just on multiple sessions to work with Roger, and we really hit it off in part because we both love 80s new wave music and obscure post-punk stuff, and so we just kind of connected on that level. And then he comes to me, he says, well, I'm putting together this project, and it's me and two of the other guys that were in Jellyfish that I didn't really recognize as songwriters, but then come to realize they're great songwriters, and now we want to do something. And we're not trying to recreate Jellyfish, but we also understand that there's going to be a certain expectation of a certain level of quality. And so that was sort of what we talked about doing. But I said, I would really enjoy making a record that wasn't trying to be blown out drums and blown out vocals. And that's Roger's aesthetic is more 70s and 80s era where there's just a little bit more nuance. A big part of that drum sound, I couldn't discuss that drum sound without discussing Jeremy Stacy, who is the drummer, who is one of the best drummers on the planet, I think, and one of the best drummers I've ever worked with. And he would get into my business. He cared about what microphones we were using, where we were placing it. So I had to, I think he's does some engineering himself. I think he's more known as a drummer, but he gets deep into it. And the one thing that he said is, I like my drums to ring a little bit. And like, I'm going to want them to ring more than you're going to want them to ring. But he tuned his drums in a way that it really worked. And I would say that even on that record, I think it was very rare that I used any samples at all. Meaning that what you hear on the kick and snare and toms is the recording that we got. And part of it's because we spent so much time. He even brought multiple drum kits. And what was funny is we set up a Premiere drum kit, cut a couple songs, and then we kind of got to like, all right, it's time to vary this up a little bit. And we popped another drum kit in and cut a couple takes. And we're like, nah, we're going to go back to the Premiere. Like we had really locked in a great sound with this certain set of shells.
Yeah.
And the room that we were in was a booth, basically. It wasn't a big room. And that also makes the drums like sing a little bit differently than they do in a big room. You know what I mean?
Can you remember how big the room was? Because when you say booth, what does that mean as far as size and shape, when we're visualizing?
I would say that this room was probably like 10 by 12, 10 by 14, like not much bigger than a bedroom. And it was difficult to fit the drums and all the mic stands in there.
Right.
It was a tight room, but that was the sort of booth sound that we were going for. And it really made the drums nice and punchy. We recorded it through an API console, which, it's funny. I on paper, I love Neve consoles are my favorite consoles. I think they're the best sounding consoles. But when I listen to the favorite records I've worked on, they all seem to be done on APIs. So wow. I think that maybe I love API at least as much, maybe even more than Neves, especially for like, you know, when you're really just kind of going for just a punchy sound. That's it to me. And that was one of the newer API consoles, and people who say those don't sound like the old ones, I don't think they do sound like the old ones, but they sound great. I think that they sound really good. And also, I think you get when the whole band is going through one console, through one topology, I think it makes for a more coherent sounding record. And
yeah, that's cool, man. Yeah, I'm always, I mean, I've had my chance to work on some different consoles, but probably not as often as you. So I get glimpses of what different sounds are, but to really experience tracking a whole record on a console like the API is pretty awesome.
Well, I'll tell you, yeah, that being said, I don't know if I can always pick out, like when I'm driving in the car and I'm listening to the radio, I don't hear a song and go, oh, that's clearly an API.
Right.
You know, I don't hear a song and go, oh, that's clearly a P bass as opposed to a jazz bass. Or that's clearly a Strat, not a Les Paul. Every now and then something comes along and it really surprises me. I thought it would have been this and it was that.
Yeah.
So often. But yeah, that was everything about the Licorice Quartet project was great because the guys in the band had great taste and their ability to execute their good ideas and their ability to also know that what they wanted to achieve wasn't going to happen fast. You know, they really, you know, they really took their time. There's a whole overdub process. I wasn't involved. I cut the tracks and I mixed them, but then and I did some of the overdubs, but they also worked with a really talented guy in LA called Frankie Siragusa, who did a great job at the overdubs. And he, again, was also very in tune aesthetically to what the band was doing.
Well, so one of the notes I took was punchy drums against acoustic guitars. And to me, that's one of those striking differences that really speaks to that process that you're describing, where it's like you arrive at this rock and roll sound that kind of needs to be an overdub process to get there.
Well, and it's funny because if it's a song, they have one song. The song that seemed to have gotten the most reaction was a song called Lighthouse Spaceship. And that's kind of the most Bowie-esque song, I would say.
Yeah.
And what's funny is the acoustic guitar sound in general is two of the guys playing acoustic guitar on a figure eight pattern against each other, playing the exact same shapes in the exact same part. And we would really hyper focus on making sure that their acoustic cadence and everything was as closely matched as possible. And that's what you hear on the record. So it's in mono and it's right up the middle, but it's two guitars and they were recorded with them staring right at each other. And we were just going for this very specific sound performance.
That's cool. And that's just that great reminder that, you know, like it doesn't always have to be this way, but rock stars, pay attention to matching your strums sometimes when you double a guitar and something, like match it exactly and see what happens. Because it can be a very cool thing when things are unified like that.
And especially with acoustic guitar, you got to be careful. And this is getting a little bit tangential, but the other thing it reminds me of is that, so what we've created is a double, like we're doing like a live double, more or less.
Yeah.
And, you know, the one interesting thing, what I love so much about Roger is he's got a vision in his head of what the final thing is going to sound like, but he will admittedly, he's not a mixer. He's not an engineer. So he'll describe to me what he wants. And then I have to, he doesn't watch a bunch of YouTube videos and start making suggestions, which kind of drives me crazy when people do that. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, you know, whenever somebody says, well, how about we sidechain? I'm like, oh no, here we go. But
do they ever say, but Ken, I heard you talk about this once on Recording Studio Rockstars.
Yeah, you can do this. I know you can. But specifically when we talk about doubles, what I find really, and you mentioned the acoustic guitar and matching your strumming patterns, or just making sure that they complement each other and they don't create cross rhythms, is what I call them, like where they where they feel like they're going against the groove. But in general, part of the juicy magic of a double is when you, especially like with a vocal, if you have a lead vocal, and then you double it, and then they're coming out the same speaker, that's one sound. But if you spread them across and put one on the left and one on the right, that's a different sound. And there's not one that's better than the other. But if you're going for more of a vintage vibe, you're not going to want that double to spread out, because that will make it sound more modern. Now, if you want both, what you need to do is you need to triple track. So say you're doing like oohs and ahs and backing vocals or harmony vocals. You're going to want one going out the left, you're going to want one going out the right, and you're going to want one going out the middle. So that way, the left one is interacting with the middle one, and the right one's interacting with the middle one, and it creates that juicy, multiple tracked vibe. If you just pan one to the left and one to the right, you're just going to get this like, I'm trying to sell you a stereo system sort of vibe, and it's a different sound, and that's one of those things. Like, or sometimes on their backing vocals, it will be oftentimes it'll be 9 tracks. There'll be 3 on the left, 3 in the middle, 3 in the right, and then of course you have to bounce those down. And they would do it with 3 singers on their on the microphone, so you would have like 27 vocals.
Wow.
And then they would do it for each note. Like if you want to get that Queen Mutt Lange, sound, it's stacks of vocals, and you don't harmonize together on the microphone. Everybody sings in unison together, and then everyone sings the next note together, and then the next note together, and you stack it all up.
What have you learned about smart ways to do that? I mean, because sometimes people sing the same note and they just can't sing in tune because they can't tell which note is their note.
Well, singing in unison, for me, I'm no lead singer, but I can do backing vocals, and it's much easier for me to sing in harmony than it is to sing in unison. It's very difficult to do. One of the things, I was doing some backing vocals with Steve McDonald, this bass player, and he's married to this woman named Anna Warrenker, who's an amazing singer. And all the 3 of us were out together, and we were stacking them up. And she said to me, like, add some falsetto in it. It'll be like Velcro. Like, you'll blend with us better if you add a little bit of falsetto. Or not falsetto, I'm sorry, vibrato. And the nice thing about vibrato is vibrato allows you to keep, as you're adding vibrato, you're also correcting your pitch as you go.
Yeah.
Whereas if you don't add any vibrato, and you go start sharp, it's hard to get back in tune again.
Yeah. Well, it's called do it over. Do it again.
Yeah, do it again. But you can only do it again so many times. If you're in a room with some people, eventually they're going to be like, hey man, maybe you might want to sit this one out.
Can you go do the lunch run for us?
Yeah, exactly. But those guys are really good at it, and they're really good at singing unison. And you get a blend on the microphone with all 3 voices, and you just, the biggest way to make that successful is to
gotta take an ear off, right?
Well, yeah, taking an ear off can often help, but just in general, making sure that everyone knows what the plan is, and know, like, we can't judge this until we have it all done. So say, for example, like, you sing one take of the vocals and you go, well, that isn't very good. And then you add the double and you go, well, okay, that's starting to kind of work. And then you triple track it, and now it sounds like this big juicy thing. And then you can't really judge what you've done until you've laid it out as you intended to do it.
Yeah, and it also helps if you can make a call in hindsight, because sometimes you put down one pass and it kind of screwed you up for the double and the triple. And sometimes you have to make the call, you know what, let's go. I don't think number 1 was that good. Let's do it again. And that can also improve it, right?
For sure. And also, when I do those types of backing vocal tracks, I try to set up all my tracks and label them in advance. So once we get it on the microphone, we're doing it rapid fire.
Yeah.
We're moving fast, and we're going through it. And exactly, you do the first track, and then you do the second, and then you do the third, and then you might go back and redo the first one again, because now the muscle memorization is there in their voices.
How do you like to work in that setting? Do you like to have a loud center track that you're recording onto, and then you just pull the clip down into, A and B for left and right, and then you've got a working track and you're just pulling it down to these other tracks? Or do you like to put each track into record as you go, and then you find you have to like bring the level up, bring the level back down into the mix kind of stuff?
I've seen that way of working, the first way you describe, where you have like a record track and then you're dragging clips down. And here we go to the beginning of that's something I don't normally do, but maybe I should check that out again. It's not a part of my workflow, but it's not a bad way to work. And I've seen people do it very fast and efficiently. For myself, I just I put the tracks in record and out of record. And the other thing is that we map out what we're going to do, and they don't hear really anything until we have it all together. So in other words, they're not singing against themselves, even as they do the harmonies. You work out on the piano what you want the harmonies to be. Okay, this is going to be the first pass, and you do it. When you do the second take of the first pass, you don't listen to the first because it's going to pull you out of tune.
Okay.
And then even when you get into the harmony, you know that the harmony, once you figure out what harmony is going to work correctly, you don't even listen to the first pass. You just focus on just that harmony as if it's not the harmony, as if it's the melody.
It's a lone note.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good tip.
Yeah. That's the way we tend to do it. And it works pretty well.
Yeah. And I think rock stars, just to reiterate that in case you're trying to picture it, different ways to stack vocals and build stuff. One way is, you put something down, and then you hear that and you put down the next one, and now you hear both of those and you put one down, and then you're trying to train yourself to sing correctly and not be thrown off by those other sounds, but you're hearing all the sounds at the same time. And then the way that Ken is just talking about right now is saying, no, don't hear those previous ones. Just try and deliver the same thing each time as the first note. And then like when you get your bass note down and you're going to go do your third harmony, don't listen to the root note, just do the third harmony. And again, don't hear these others while you work. Do you sometimes find that when you do that way, Ken, it can be easy to drift? You're drifting a little too far from the shore, so to speak?
The biggest challenge with that is more about getting the phrasing, like ending the words at the right spot correctly.
Right.
But I would tell your listeners, your rock stars, that if you have any singing ability at all, and you like pop music, and you like producing pop music, set up a microphone and do it yourself. Just find some oohs and ahs and do it yourself, because and I'll go tell my family, like, hey, it's going to sound like I'm skinning a cat in the other room. Like, don't call the police. Like, it's going to sound terrible. It's going to sound terrible when you listen to the individual ones on their own. But when you put it together, you'll be shocked at how well it will actually work if you commit yourself to it. And you don't need to auto-tune or do any of that stuff. Just by stacking it, you'll create this thick, gooey vocal sound. And if nothing else, you'll either learn two things. You'll learn, hey, I can actually do this. I can actually do this for real. Or B, I don't have the voice to do this, but now every time you get behind a microphone, you're going to learn something about being behind the microphone. And that's going to help you become a better engineer and help you work with singers better.
I think that's super smart. And I think it's an encouragement to us to go try out every instrument in the studio for that very reason, so that we get familiar with how it's played, what happens when you hit it a certain way, the drums and how they show up in a mic, and what it feels like to be on the other side of the glass. Because, if we're the engineer and if we're a home studio person recording ourselves, then, it's built into the equation.
Yeah, and I would even say, if you're an engineer and you're getting ready to do a vocal session and you get the microphone line checked and it's going and it's working, and that the singer's not there yet, you haven't really dialed in the sound, but I always, if I'm in a session, I get the starting point. I get the knobs turned about where I think it's going to work. And then I'll go out onto the microphone and I'll have the assistant like, here, run the track. And I sing along as best as I can. And it sounds ridiculous, but I want to make sure that I can hear all the detail, that I can hear my voice loud enough that the power amps aren't crapping out when I sing loud. That you can sing as loud as you want without the gear shitting the bed. And you want to make sure that it's working properly. And that the reverb isn't too insane or the delay isn't going to be distracting, and that the cue box is working. Everything's routed onto the cue box. And so that way, like, you're going to have a better session with your singer if you know that, like, it's not just that the microphone's working, but that it's working really well and doing what it's meant to do.
The S-Series by Atom Audio, crafted in Berlin, is a flagship line of reference monitors, blending advanced engineering and in-house design. With 5 models in various sizes and configurations, these monitors build on Atom Audio's iconic heritage while incorporating new technology for improved acoustic performance. The range includes the compact S2V with the 7-inch woofer, the 3-way S3H with twin 7-inch woofers, the vertical S3V with a single 9-inch woofer, and the powerful S5H and S5V main monitors featuring a 12-inch woofer and exceeding 131 dBSPL per pair. Despite differences in size and power, all these models provide highly analytical sound for professional audio applications. The S-Series includes new woofers, mid-range drivers, redesigned waveguides, and a DSP engine for crossover optimization. The result is accurate frequency response, consistent dispersion, enhanced detail in bass and mid frequencies with wider frequency ranges, and forward-looking digital connectivity, all in a durable design. The S-Series ensures longevity in your studio, backed with a 5-year guarantee at atomaudio.com. Yeah, it took me a long time. I'm embarrassed to say how many years it took me to learn. Never send a singer out to the microphone until you've been out on the mic with the headphones on yourself, confirming that it's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, and me too. I worked in Chicago for many years and had a great time and worked on a bunch of cool records. But when I moved to LA, I was assisting again, and I just learned the value of having everything set up and ready to go before the musicians arrive, because it's so much easier to sound check and test everything when you're just there by yourself or working with an assistant or have one helper. The moment the band walks into the room, hey man, where can I put my food? Hey, where's the bathroom? Hey man, is my car okay parked out there? And it's all, you're trying to get the session going, and they're going to ask you about everything.
Yeah.
And it's distracting. So you want to know that, like, I'm ready to go. I am 100% ready to go. And then also, say for example, if it's a 3-piece band, and you set up the drum mics and you set up the bass rig and you set up a guitar amp, set up a second guitar amp rig and ready to go. I always have an A and B, because one, you don't know if someone's going to drop by and like, oh, Bill's going to come by and play on this song, or the guitar player shows up, but he's got 2 separate amps. You don't have to tell anyone to hold on. You have a B chain all ready to go.
Yeah.
Like, I think that that's always just really good advice.
Yeah, I think that's super smart. I mean, what you're describing is when you're responsible for engineering a session, there's a lot of work to be done. But the moment the band shows up, they expect you to be, Ricardo Montalban is welcome to Fantasy Island, and they want to chat with you about everything. And you're like, and you quickly realize, oops, I don't get to do any more patching or any more, I don't get to be a scientist anymore in this moment. I got to be a host.
You're hosting now. Exactly. It's exactly what's happening.
All right. So now we have made the Rockstars wait patiently for ages to hear about your new studio. So tell us about your new studio. You got settled in and you have gotten into some new speaker setups, I believe, right?
Yeah, well, so uh, I was I was mixing, just putting speakers in the garage that was unfinished and too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. And then when it got too cold in the winter, I would move it into the house, and the family's hearing me as I'm mixing and I'm working and I'm just dealing with that. And finally, around 2020, I built out the garage as a mix room, and I decided I didn't want to put the money and effort into building an extra booth. That's not really what it's designed for. It's designed to be a place to mix, do pre-production, some overdubs. I can record singers in here, but not in a booth. It's, the singer sets up in a room with me. We both wear headphones. And I also decided I wasn't going to spend money on splayed walls or any soundproofing or build out. Our house is in a neighborhood, but it's not that close to the next house. I wasn't recording drums on a regular basis or loud guitar amps. And the funny thing is that a loud guitar amp isn't that bad for the neighbors if you're playing a bunch of songs over and over. But the nature of a guitar overdub is you're playing the one lick 20 times in a row. And that's what will drive people insane. If you have to listen to that and you're not involved with what's going on, you're like, come on, get over it.
This is why it's no fun when your friend invites you to stop by the studio and hang out. You learn that quickly as an engineer.
Yeah. You might go hours working on a mix before you play it from top to bottom, but so it's really just designed as a mix room. And I loved it. I was so happy. Just so nice to have it in my home, for all the cliched reasons, like it's a short commute and all that stuff. But also, it's because if I get mix notes, mix revision notes at 10 o'clock at night, I can just go walk into my room and oh yeah, this will take me 20 minutes to do these notes. I just walk in the room and I can send it so I can keep things moving along.
Yeah.
For me, just the way my mixing workflow works, if I had to get in a car and drive somewhere,
9 a.m. or 9 p.m.
It would probably more likely be at 9 p.m. But to go and revise the mix, that would drive me crazy. And then also, I think that like having a production, they kind of call them production room now in LA, production rooms in LA, which means like a room set up very similar to mine, where it's like an overdub mix room, but you might have it like in a hallway with a bunch of other dudes, and you share a bathroom and you share a common area.
Mm-hmm.
And that's cool to be a part of a community. For myself, I've worked in those environments before, and I find that there's just like people popping in to talk about gear is nice, but it'll almost be a 30-year day if you don't be disciplined about it. And I like to do it. I'm a affable guy. I like talking to people. I'm a people person. So it's not about them. It's not about them distracting me. It's about me getting caught up in all the camaraderie. And then next, it's like, wait a minute, I've been here for 12 hours and I've only gotten 8 hours of work done today. That's a problem for me.
Yes.
So I need the privacy for myself.
I think about what you're saying too, and the difference between old school record making, where that concept of, the record plant and, these famous artists and producers, engineers are walking by each other's studios. Those were times, well, maybe those were quicker records, but there was a time where, 6 months on a record or whatever that's like a no-brainer. You're going to be working on this stuff for ages. And in those situations, probably was nice to have somebody come interrupt these long ass days.
For sure, especially if you're working with one other person. For some reason, I have found, and maybe this is just me and my personality, but for myself, if it's just me and someone else, we'll eventually drive each other crazy. But if it's 3 people, for some reason, 3 is the magic number on a project. 4 is too many. 2 is not enough. 3 is if one person's being irritated, at least you have one other person that you can, connect with, and so, yeah, I like it. And having the networking and the community, there's a value to that, and there might come a time in my life where I want more of that. And when I do go work at studios, I do enjoy that. But on a day-to-day basis, for me, I have to have a private room that I can go to and work uninterrupted and not. And part of it is I don't want to talk about gear anymore.
Yeah.
I don't want someone to go, oh man, I want to lend you my $5,000 compressor. Well, I'm not in the market for the $5,000 compressor, so I'm going to love it. And then what do we do? I don't want to do that. I don't want to put myself in those situations anymore.
Have you noticed your methods and everything sort of in the studio evolve along with life stuff like family and things like that too? Has that been part of your story as far as how you work and how you like to work and how much time you want to spend in the studio and all that?
Well, I have to say that focusing on mixing, and when I say that, it doesn't mean that I only want to mix full time, because I want to do recording sessions. I'm available for recording sessions, but it just seems like when I assess, like when I look over the years, like, oh, most of my time was spent mixing. And the nice part about that is, like when my kids were in high school, they were in sports, and I was able to be working on a mix, and I know that, hey, their game starts at 4:30, and so it's going to take me 20 minutes to get there. So at 4:10, I just stop, go watch the game, come back home, keep working, and I try to structure my day so I work to the point where I'm going to need that break. You know what I mean? I don't want to be working on something that's like I'm right in the middle of like a creative moment of creative discovery.
Right.
So I build those breaks into the day, and I've been able to be a part of their lives, which I wasn't when they were younger. I mean, I remember at one point I got this is like in the 2000s. I got a phone call about some mixes that needed to be redone, and I had to leave my daughter's birthday party. She was like 3 years old, and I'm like, "Honey, I gotta go. Like, this is a deadline. I have to drive to the studio to make these changes." That was rough to do, and if that's the way it worked now, but it's just so nice now to work unattended. And when I say unattended, it doesn't mean I don't want someone here that I'm working with, but I want to at least get the first pass of a mix on my own.
Yeah.
Because I find that especially with mixing, if the artist is with me from the get-go, and that's the way I worked with Roger, and it worked with him, but in general, it doesn't work because usually I'm focused on their to-do list, and then my to-do list never gets to done. Yeah. Well, it never gets to done. And then the moment, and this is something that's important for the rock stars to remember, is as a mixer, the moment you send a file to the client, you have to be prepared for them to accept that file. That you could say to them, "Hey, I didn't really get to fine-tune the drums the way I wanted to, but I'm gonna do that." No, they'll get used to that drum sound, as flawed as it is, and then if you're gonna change it, it will feel wrong to them. So you really have to make sure that any file you send off, you're willing to sign off on any element of that. And if you're working with someone and next they go, "Hey, yeah, just send me a file, at the end of the day file." No, that's not the end of the day file. That's possibly the final mix.
It's the end of your life file.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough lesson. I've heard people talk about, I can't remember if it was like, Chris Lord-Alge and Tom Lord-Alge, those guys talking about it or who it was, but the concept of when you do the rough mix at the end of a session, make sure it's a mix that you send somebody, because that has a huge impact. And I've learned to do that much, much quicker now than I ever could before, and at least get it to something that I feel much better about. One of the tricks I like doing is actually, I think it's great if you can let yourself really dial a mix in at the end of a session. And I'm talking about like tracking, overdub.
Yeah.
But one trick that helps me, because I'm usually also shot, with energy in my ears, is I just put it down at really quiet and put it on a little Auratone, my Avantone speaker in mono. And I just do a quick balance between things. Like, can I actually hear all these things?
Yeah.
And I'm always struck with how well that works as far as a quick rough goes.
Well, and it's hard, and that's funny that you mentioned that, because oftentimes the quick rough mix is also like the fuck off playback mix for the band, where it's like, put it on the mains and let's get excited and put it down. And you're like, but I can't mix this on these speakers at this volume. It's
Right.
Everything sounds great. So, it's a tricky thing to do, but to your point, I think rough mixes are really important to get right. And if an artist sends me a multi-track and there's no rough mix, and they go, and I say, where's the rough? And they go, I didn't make a rough. It's like, you haven't proved that your song is ready to be mixed yet. If the song isn't ready,
prove that no matter what you do, you who knows if it's going to match the vision in their head.
Right, because even if it's not a good rough mix, you'll still learn something about how they wanted it. You know what I mean? So there's no such thing as all rough mixes have something in them that you can learn, even if it's just making sure that all the elements are actually there correctly.
Yeah, indeed, especially when somebody's sending you stuff, because you don't know if they're missing the saxophone and the keyboard and the whatever.
Yeah, how would I know?
So, did you have you gotten into Atmos and immersive mixing as well?
So yeah, so getting to my speaker array about 2 years ago, and it's funny because had I known Atmos was on the horizon, I wouldn't have put my door where it is. like I built the studio, I'm happy as can be. And then Atmos comes around and everybody wants to get on board. And for myself, in general, it wasn't so much that like I don't have the story of like, I heard an Atmos demonstration and it blew my mind and I became a zealot for Atmos. And I think that's the way everything should be now. I don't know if I'm in that camp. I'm more in if there's a new format to mix music in, if I'm going to be a contemporary music mixer, I want to learn the format.
Mm-hmm.
And I do enjoy it. I enjoy it quite a bit. The learning curve was steeper than anything I've come across in my career in a while. Just learning how Dante works, learning how the Dolby renderer works, learning like why binaural mixes on headphones don't sound the way they do on speaker arrays, which that's a whole nother conversation to get into that I don't know if I'm the best person to go down that particular rabbit hole. But I wanted to do it. I wanted to get into it. And
did you try mixing in headphones a little bit to see how it would go?
I don't hear spatial in headphones. Yeah. For the longest time, I'm like, I'm not doing this right. Something's broke. Like something's not routed correctly. There's a button I need to push. And then finally, the more I learned about it, I'm like, no, my brain doesn't process spatial in a binaural setting. It will to a point with like short percussive things, but anything long and sustained, say, for example, if in an Atmos mix, you take a string pad and you put it in the rears, on binaural, that doesn't really translate. Only sharp percussive things can really, like sound effecty type things, can really give you the sensation of it's above my head, it's behind me.
Yeah.
But I don't really get that, and that's probably, to be honest, that's the biggest challenge with Atmos right now is getting consumers to be interested in something that I don't know if they hear it on AirPods.
Do you ever feel like the time that you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take you years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen to this quote from one of our students, David. Quote, "Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process that I've ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, but condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session, close quote. Look, I'm so confident that this will take your mixes to the next level that if you can't get a killer mix within 30 days, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. So if you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and start now by checking out the free preview of the ultimate snare mixing trick. And I'll see you at the front row table of the Grammys. Cheers. I don't think it exists yet, is my honest take on it. I think that, so Rockstars, what we're talking about is the way that a format like Atmos will fold down to a pair of headphones and convert to a binaural representation so that you can take a sound that was placed in any one of the speakers that are surrounding you in a room, and it'll feel that way in headphones. I have heard binaural recordings that sounded incredibly convincing about overhead and under and behind, but they were recorded that way with a binaural microphone, a dummy head microphone in a really careful setting. Andres Mayo, who's been on the podcast, he specifically did some of those recordings and they were striking. But I think that the folding down thing, I sort of suspect that it folds down so that it creates a sense of space in the earphones and more depth and more three dimensions, but it doesn't quite sound like a dinosaur's right behind my head or if we're close to Halloween, a ghoul.
That I would say that your assessment is, or your observation is correct, that you do get more of a sense of space if you're listening specifically like on AirPods. And that might help some music, and some music doesn't want that space. Some rock and roll music's supposed to be upfront, punchy. Sometimes stereo's almost too much for some rock music,
Mm-hmm.
And now you're spreading out. Like, if you're gonna, I don't know if you would. I don't know if there's like Ramones Atmos mixes, but if there were, it's like, what would you do? I mean, maybe it would be interesting to feel like you were at CBGB's and have like the sound of like, the band being on the front of the stage, but in general, and then there's some music that really wants to be in Atmos, really, really lends itself well to it because it's not based on watching a performance from a stage.
Well, you already described an example of that with the figure 8 microphone and 2 guitars playing on it at the same time, so that the doubled acoustic was front center in mono.
Yeah.
It was intentionally created that way as opposed to being created left and right. Just because something can be in the left and right speaker doesn't mean that that's the best place for it. Same thing with the vocal doubling panned out versus tripling and layering it in those other manners. So that makes perfect sense that, an immersive speakers all around you wouldn't automatically make sense to put something all around you.
Right. Well, and also, I mean, a lot of artists hear Atmos and they're inspired and they say, I want to make the record in Atmos from the beginning. And what they really mean is I want to make the record in 714 because you can't actually monitor an Atmos whilst like recording because the latency is so intense that wouldn't actually be possible to do. But you could route things to the speakers, and then when it's all done, then you can get into turning things into what's called objects, which are a sound that's designed to move and pan around across speakers, for example.
That's great. You're the first person to bring that up. I've done a lot of Atmos interviews already, and thank you for mentioning that and reminding us that the concept of recording something and hearing it as an object in the creation process, the latency would cause an issue. I guess, do you think that would exist even for synthesized sounds and keyboards and things because of sort of buffer latency for MIDI performing? I guess you could program something to be an object.
I mean, latency is a funny topic because I am now discovering for myself that I feel like I'm much more sensitive than I thought I was. to latency, and I'll tell you, so if I'm sitting, at home, like I was working on this record that I was playing guitar on, and I'd have a little idea for something that would be very rhythmic, and I would just be playing it on the guitar as I was listening to the track, like playing this little rhythmic part, and I'd be like, oh, this is going to be cool. And I plug it in. I make sure that my playback settings in Pro Tools are low enough that I don't feel any latency. And then I start playing the part as an overdub, and it ain't coming across the same. And I'm like, oh God, like I have such bad rhythm. I need to go beat detective this guitar part and put it into time or whatever. And I was working with a friend of mine who's like, but you sounded perfect when you were playing it before you plugged your guitar into the Pro Tools. And it hit me like a brick. Even like 64, round trip samples or 32, musicians are more sensitive to latency than you think you are.
Yeah.
And what I would say is across the board, this whole trend of micro editing musicians and putting them into time, of which I'm guilty as everybody else of doing it. It's in part because they're playing it into a computer, and even a TDM computer, even a computer with the fast throughput is going to have latency in it. And I think these musicians, even though they don't feel like they're feeling it, and it's messing up their playing.
I remember hearing a story about a vocal group right at the transition from analog to digital that was famous for, stacking all these beautiful harmonies. And that when they hit the studio, I don't remember who it was, but when they first tried to switch over to digital, and this would have been digital tape machines at the time, they were having trouble singing in tune because even that, dedicated circuitry latency that was in a digital tape recorder back in the day was throwing them off. Maybe it was an early Pro Tools, maybe it was a digital tape. But that, that I've noticed that if I set the latency a little too high, where it's obviously, it's a couple milliseconds, a few milliseconds off, I was hearing my voice in the headphones and I was like, I can't sing to this, So
no,
I think that's
it's
really
distracting, and it really messes with your performance. And like I said, and I've just recently noticed how bad it is, meaning that like, even if I intellectually think to myself, oh, I'm not hearing any latency, I pluck the guitar and I go, no, that sounds fine. But I'm noticing I can't play the figures the way I thought. It doesn't sound as good. It doesn't feel as good.
Yeah. And was this with an amp that was being mic'd up, or was this, you were using a digital amp?
Both. I mean, it was a digital amp on the example when I finally, realized it. But I'm realizing anytime you're going through a computer, it's something that I would love to see people focus on. You know what I mean? As far as, instead of more new features, I'd be very curious to see if they came out with a version. And maybe I'm talking out of class here. Maybe I'm talking beyond what I know. But if they came along and they said, hey, with this new system here, now we have latency that's similar to an analog tape machine, I'd be curious to see how much micro editing needed to be done.
Huh.
Well, because I've been for years thinking to myself, maybe this new generation of musicians just aren't as good as the older generation. And maybe some of that's true, but I feel like this is it just seems like it's like this epidemic that's happening of people not playing. I'm not talking about people playing like in time, but I'm talking about like locking into a groove that sounds musical.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess a couple of ways to consider that would be acoustic bands that are performing acoustically in a space together, recorded through the microphones where they're not hearing through the headphones, or bands recording situations where the headphones, everybody's hearing each other through the console, analog, before it hits the digital, would be a potentially a good solution for that. And a digital console wouldn't count, rock stars.
Right. No, which is routing wise and workflow wise, it would be very challenging. It'd be very challenging to go punch in.
Yeah.
But so that's an observation just on latency, not so much Atmos. I would say that there are guys that could probably talk a lot more knowledgeably about Atmos mixing than I would be, because I try to kind of keep it simple. But what has been the most interesting thing for me diving into this is working on catalog titles where I've been rebuilding like mixes that already exist from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, across the whole range of it. And what I've learned from having to recreate something is what I find the most interesting aspect of my recent work.
Well, that's cool. What do you want to share? Any? Maybe you can't get into specifics of the records themselves, but do you want to share any specific thoughts about recreating some old recording techniques or old records in a record that maybe started out as maybe stereo was too much for mono at that point the record was made? How does Atmos not become too much for stereo?
I've even done rebuilds for other Atmos mixers as well, where because here's the way the timeline tends to work is at a certain point the labels decide we need to release this title as an Atmos mix, and we need it by November 30th, and it's say
which is the date of this podcast. Wouldn't be that far away, Rockstars.
Oh, right. Okay. So let's say that that's decided today. The first 3 weeks might be spent tracking down the actual audio assets, finding the multi-track. And then by the time it gets to you, they're like, we need this entire record in a week.
Yeah.
And so I know, guys who will get into doing that and they'll say, listen, I need a bit of a team here. So they're like, you rebuild the mix, I'll do the Atmos mix. And because the Atmos mix is the fun part, the rebuilding is the difficult part.
Right.
And so typically, and I'm not gonna mention any actual band names for a lot of reasons. A lot of it is because some of the stuff hasn't been released yet. Some of the stuff may not get released, and just in general, or I might be doing it for somebody else.
Yeah.
But in general, what I've found is that first of all, any part of the Atmos spec is that the Atmos mix needs to be the exact time as the release version of the record.
That's right. That's
file,
an upload requirement by Apple and other places.
That's right. And now some people can cheat a little bit and just make sure that the file is the exact same size. But in general, the idea is that the music happens concurrently. So the first thing that happens is that you get what they call a comparison master, which is the stereo mix that they want you to replicate. And then you have the multi-tracks. Now, even if, aside from the fact that there might be edits in the multi-track, like maybe there's a third verse that didn't end up in the final version that you have to cut out, so there's those aspects. Or maybe for some early hip hop, they would just build like a groove onto a multi-track and then have singers sing over the one groove and then print different mixes onto a DAT machine and then edit the stereo DAT into a mix, So you have to recreate all that. But I won't get into that because that's getting deeper into it. But just even if you have a multi-track where the multi-track is laid out as the final mix, the first thing you have to do is very speed it to get it in time. And what's interesting is that we understand that digital is much more accurate than analog as far as timing is concerned. But I've never really thought that all analog machines, even like clocks, say for example, if you have two clocks in your house, you have one clock in your alarm clock in your bedroom, and then your alarm clock and then a clock that hangs on your wall in your kitchen. And one day you go and you take the clock from your kitchen and you go to your alarm clock. And when it clicks at 12 o'clock, you make sure it's exactly in time. So now those two clocks are perfectly in time. Well, of course, they're not going to stay perfectly in time together. But what's going to happen is they're going to diverge. One is going to be faster or slower than the other one. And so on a multi-track will diverge from the original master to the point where if you line up the first beat and you make it work perfectly, by the time you get to the end of the song, it's going to sound like it's falling down the stairs. It'll be a mess. And so what you have to do is you have to take the very last beat of the song or the very last moment of the song and very speed it so it lines up with the original version. And then you play back the two together and you until they're going like just phasing together.
Right. They're so
and
close that they're just creating a phaser sound.
Exactly. And not only does that help keep it in time, but it helps with the sound, because suddenly now it'll be brighter or darker because it's a different pitch. It's a slightly different pitch.
Right.
So if something's 20 cents sharper, it's going to sound like it has more treble on it because it's higher. And so right off the bat, you get that going. And then from there, you just go and say, okay, the drums. Let's see, is there a spot in the song where there's just the drum kit, where I can just focus on the drum kit? You go find that spot, and you just flip back and forth, and you just keep mixing your drums until you get them panned exactly the same and balanced exactly the same as the original version. And make sure that the one guitar that's on the left is on the right. Make sure that there's no tracks that weren't used. Make sure you have to match the vocal reverb. Sometimes, if it's a record that has articles, I'll go online and type mix online classic tracks, and if I can read an article about the way the record was made, that might be helpful to know, was this mixed on an SSL or was it mixed on a API? Then if it's mixed on an API and it was mixed at this studio and they had 2 compressors and a plate reverb, then I tell my plugins I can only have 1 plate reverb and I can only use 2 compressors on this entire mix. Nice. And you just keep working on it and just by ear refining it until you get to the point where you're flipping back and forth between your live mix and the original mix, and you can't tell the difference between the two.
This podcast is proud to present Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I master my own records using nothing but plugins. Plus, I take you into a world-class mastering studio, Sterling Sound, to meet with Ryan Smith and hear how he professionally mastered my record, Skadoosh, for release to streaming platforms. That's the music you hear on this podcast, Rockstars. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free mixing course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even upload to your website if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy to get started now. You had made a note before this interview, this line, doing more with less gear. That sounds like that's tapping into that concept too.
Well, and that's what I've come to learn is that there's much less outboard gear. In other words, the sound of the record is built into the multi-track for most of these classic recordings, all the good ones. And so at that point, you're just matching pans and volumes and maybe doing a little bit of EQ touch up here and there, but not nearly as much as you would think. And yeah, just there wasn't 25 compressors on 25 tracks or there was 2. There was one on the lead vocal, sometimes not even that. Sometimes you would just keep simplifying it, and then you take stuff off and you go, okay, now this sounds like the mix.
Yeah, at least you're not missing the Melodon file that they used for the vocal.
Yeah, no. Well, I did have one record that I rebuilt that was done in 2002, and it had a bunch of amp farm all over it. So when I opened up the multi-tracks, the guitars were going plunk, 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 just sounding terrible. And then fortunately, they still make amp farm, and so I was able
line
to
6, right?
Yeah. So I was able to upgrade my license. And when I did that, boom, it popped in, and the guitars, they actually sounded really good. It was actually I was like, oh, this sounds better than I remembered.
I remember when Amp Farm came out being so amazed by that stuff. And then also quickly realizing this is not going to work for rock guitars. I mean, I guess it depends on which ones you did. And it does now, but at the time I remember it was a good tremolo reverb, an effecty guitar really moved well on those.
Well, and I find in that era, what it seemed to be is if you were going to layer guitars on top of each other, eventually it would just all turn into like a cloudy mess. But like to use it for a track here or there worked great. But if you said, no, I'm going to make this record and everything's going to be through Amp Farm and there's going to be like 10 tracks of guitar in every song, that would be difficult to mix because it all just turns into hash.
Yeah, it was probably because of the whole Nyquist EQ filter and, aliasing folding back down from overtones and harmonics and stuff like that. And I'm saying that not as a scientist, but just as,
yeah, who knows? Maybe
throwing that out there.
Yeah, I don't know why. But in general, doing the rebuilds opened my eyes to that. There's not as much. People weren't just plugging in gear just to plug it in, and then there wasn't as much automation as you would have thought there would be. And even the whole like all hands on deck with everybody. I know that was the way some records were made, but not that much. Not as much as you would think.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Well, so now once you rebuild it and you feel like, if I'm hearing you correctly, you want to get it to a starting place that at least is like where the record left off when it was originally created. And then from that point on, the next step is, okay, now how does this become, a surrounding sound, or how do we convert this into Atmos? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and then you start thinking about how to spatialize it, and there's things that I've done, and that just talking with my other Atmos friends. We have like a little informal group of guys that meet up every now and then, and especially when it was new, and we were all just learning, how to route audio from Pro Tools into the renderer, and how to like not how to do it aesthetically, but literally how to actually get the equipment working, get the software all talking to each other.
Like joining the analog tape alignment club.
Sort of, yeah. And figuring out how to get your audio file not rejected, because there's very strict overall levels that you have to adhere to. All those things, but just creatively, what we've come to learn is that like rhythmic elements, like bass and drums and rhythm guitar, they syncopate together and they percolate together in a way that if you take a rhythm guitar and you put it behind you while the drums and bass are in front of you, the groove is gonna feel different and the record is gonna feel different. So you don't really want to do that. You know what I mean? You have to. When the listener hears the Atmos mix, it has to evoke the original mix, and so things that tear the mix apart, you don't really want to do. But oohs and ahs and backing vocals and synth pads and stuff like that, those things you might want to put behind you or above your head, or a guitar solo could sort of, or like, well, the classic is the Rocket Man where the pedals steal, like the little transition moments, those can move.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to take like a lead vocal and decide, I'm gonna have this lead vocal spin around my head a little bit. That's a terrible idea.
It sort of evokes the question of what would you do if you were actually in the space. I'm just, when you described the rhythm section percolating together, I immediately imagined, okay, you just take one element of that. If you're playing rhythm guitar, this is a guitarist, and you want to really lock in, you get as close as you can to the drummer. You start like leaning over the drum set and getting in his face. And it's like, it makes sense sonically too, right?
Yeah. Well, you want to, it all needs to interact with each other in the right way. And if you spread them out across different speakers, then the interaction sounds different and will feel different to the listener. So, you want to be a little bit careful to figure out what elements you really want to separate and which elements you want to keep together.
Very cool. Well, we have been going for a good long stretch here.
Yeah.
Before we finish though, is there any more stuff about your new Atmos room you want to give a shout out to that we haven't talked about yet? Are there any particular tools that you're using in your setup that you're super happy about?
For myself, when I did my Atmos room, I wanted to I wanted to keep at least my left and right speakers exactly what I normally use for stereo. And so I have a pair of old Tannoy AMS 10s that I bought off Joe Chiccarelli. And then I bought his spare pair. So those became my rears. And for a while I was working in quad on like film scores. Uh, maybe a shout out is, it was hard to find those speakers and they're not cheap. So when I went with my side speakers, Behringer has actually bought the Tannoy name, and they've come out with their version of Tannoys called Golds, Gold 7s and 8s. And I think I paid like $500 for a pair of these just for my side speakers. And they sound incredible. They're great sounding speakers. And so I would recommend, I'm not really in the habit of recommending speakers to anybody because everybody gets what they're used to hearing. And then that becomes their reference. And, but these were shockingly good for not a lot of money. And there's a couple other speaker manufacturers that have really high performance speakers because you're going to need 12 of them. You're going to need
a lot.
Two behind you, two to the side, two behind you, and then four up top. And you could even there's like a wide position left, and if you wanted to do a 9.1.4 system, there's actually you could actually spread speakers out even wider. But I would encourage people to, if you want to mix an Atmos, I really think you need to have a speaker array. I don't see how anyone could do it on headphones. You would be guessing. You'd be guessing how it would sound good. But if you can look around and see what you have and see how to incorporate what you already have, one of the other big challenges is finding an interface that you can turn. It's as simple as a knob that turns up all 12 speakers at the same time is
right.
Apollo's up until recently didn't do it, and then they finally built it into the software, and I think only you have to have their 16 in and out do it. So it's taken a while for the manufacturers. Antelope has a product now that is a really good Atmos interface, but yeah, the challenge is getting a knob that has 12 outputs all on one knob.
Yeah, it's so funny. It makes sense to hear you say it, but you just wouldn't think of that at first. You just think we're so used to the knob volume. We never really think about what it's doing, but for a long time, it's just been sending a left and a right somewhere. And now it's got to send a whole bunch to a whole bunch of places. But I think one, is it fair to say that a takeaway for us too is while we might have, grown up experiencing some surround setups in our home theater, for example, where you had maybe a pair of speakers up front, but then you had these little satellites around you. That's not the way to think of mixing an Atmos. With Atmos, you want your speakers to all be similar or not necessarily so, or somewhere in the middle. I know you described different brands, but as far as like teeny tiny ones around you, behind you, and big ones up front, or is it ideal to have them all be similarly sized?
I think the ideal would be to have them. The ideal would probably be to have them all be exactly the same, but that's not really practical. For one, it's difficult to take really heavy speakers and mount them, up high for your height speakers.
Yeah,
I think your left and right and center speakers need to be speakers that are designed to move some air. I think that there's less bass that's going to be mixed into the sides and rears and tops. So those speakers don't need to have quite the bass performance that the other ones would need to. Even people who have high-end PMC and ATC systems, as you get into the rears and sides, those speakers don't have the same specs as the front ones.
Right.
I don't know if that's answering your question.
I think so. Yeah. And my friend Robin has a pair of the really massive ATCs up in front as left and rights. And I imagine trying to dangle those from ceilings and around would just be insane anyway. But it does make sense. I think like low end, it still kind of folds down to the subs and stuff.
And that's, you have to learn how to work with the sub, even if you don't like. I'm not a big fan of subwoofers for stereo mixing because I think that they can, if it's very difficult to get them balanced with your main speakers.
Yeah.
And if you don't do it just right, you're gonna think you have low end in your mix that you don't have, but you just have it. Your monitoring is adding low end that isn't actually there. But for Atmos mixing, you definitely are going to need it. You're going to want a little bit of your kick drum to go through there, and that you're going to have to set the filter yourself. And yeah.
Well, I got a lot to learn. I'm going to have to get into it at some point. I haven't gone there yet. But well, Ken, I think want to just say thank you so much for coming and hanging with us on Recording Studio Rockstars again. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you. Let the Rockstars know, where can they go check out more of your stuff? Where would you like them? What if they're ready to just mix their next hit record, or they just need something in Atmos? Where should they find you?
They can reach out to me. Ken Sluiter at mac.com. Or kensluiter.com. It's my emails it couldn't be easier to remember. It's not Ken Sluiter 35.2 at Gmail. It's just Ken Sluiter at mac.com.
Awesome.
And I'm on Facebook. Yeah, all the usual spots.
So I did forget. I will ask you now. This is our closing question, which I've asked you before. I'll just do it again. We're going to take the studio Wayback Machine, and you go back in time and you find younger Ken and you say, listen, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's what you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself. You can navigate that however you want this time around. Maybe you're just going back and talking about giving yourself advice before you set up your home mix studio or got into Atmos or whatever. What advice would you like to go back and give yourself if you could?
That's a great question. I'll steer it this way just to not be redundant with anything else I've ever said, but I would say don't underestimate the value of learning your communication skills. And that the most valuable asset you have isn't your amazing microphone or your compressor. It's your clients and your relationship with your clients. And as I get deeper and deeper into it, and as I try to become better at what I do, part of that isn't just learning how to operate the gear better, hear better, but just how to communicate more concisely with people, and how to make sure that I'm getting my point across as efficiently as I can. And I think that that's something that just takes a long time to learn and get good at.
Yeah. Well, just when you figured that out, then Lidge asked you to do a podcast episode with him, and he made you talk for ages anyway. So you've been doing a great job of that on this episode.
I'm still figuring it out.
No, you got it dialed in. I just keep hitting you with questions because it's so much fun to hang out with you.
Likewise.
Thanks for being here, Ken. Rockstars, thanks for listening. And Ken, I look forward to seeing you around the studio, or I see you at NAMM or wherever I see you next.
That sounds great, Lidge.
All right,
Thanks for having me on. Yeah,
cheers.
Take care.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lidge Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible: Lewitt, Grace Design, Adam Audio, Native Instruments, and Isotope. And remember, at isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plugin purchase. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, then please check out our sponsors using the links in our show notes below, because it's a great way to help support this show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio because they're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars: Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and Liz Hulitskaya. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.